What's one? So basically for today's video, I'm gonna be like filming like the 2025 recap video and like things I liked and disliked about this year. Kind of similar to like what I've done like ever since I like kind of started doing YouTube. I'm basically gonna be doing another one for 2025 now. So the first thing I gotta say about this year was this year ended up like having the best road trip I've ever been on in my life. I mean, that 2022 trip was really good though too, but I think this road trip was slightly better than the 2022 one. Me going to New River Gorge and like going whitewater rafting and ziplining the same day, and then checking out Shenandoah, and then going to DC for the first time, and then Philadelphia the same evening, and then parts of New York City, mainly like the Times Square area, but I also did see like the Statue of Liberty from a distance and part of Central Park as well there. Ended up like getting to go to Cape Cod and see some nice lighthouses, and then go to Boston after that. Then end up like going to Acadia. Enjoy getting to see that national park for the first time and getting to do the Beehive Trail, and also getting to see Bar Harbor like during the evening and all that. Got to see some waterfalls throughout upstate New York, and then I also did get to experience ziplining at Niagara Falls as well, and also got to like experience like going down to like the like journey behind the falls area and got close up to the waterfalls. So got to go to Canada for the very first time ever leaving the country and all that, and then got to see Toronto while I was there as well. Saw like a little park in Michigan before making my way to Indiana Dunes for the first time, and then ending off the trip by seeing Chicago and Milwaukee. So the East Coast trip was definitely the biggest highlight I had this year. But I mean, outside of like the road trip this year, like or like some of the like other trips I did, like the Smoky Mountains and like the Hot Springs trip, I feel like this was kind of a really crappy year to be honest, and this wasn't really my favorite year for like day trips either. Like I would say this is probably like the worst year I had for doing day trips since I started like really doing them in 2020. So I just feel like this was a pretty crappy year for like just like day-to-day life and all that compared to like the past years this decade and all that. I feel like it was even more of a downgrade compared to like how my home life was in the past compared to like how the day trips were in the past even. So I feel like this year was like a slightly better year for me at Kinkaid like than last year was, but I feel like both years were significantly worse than like 2020 to 2023 like whenever I was out there. So I'm probably not going to be doing a whole lot of Kinkaid like in the future. I might be going there like every once in a while, but I'm probably not going to be going there as often as I did during 2020 to 2023. I feel like this year really got bad like whenever like I got home from like the East Coast trip and all that, and just the time period I had in between the East Coast trip and like when I did that Smoky Mountains trip. I felt like it was just a really like boring, isolating time period, and didn't do a whole lot of day trips, and every day was kind of just like felt like it was the same and all that. Just not a lot happened during that time period. It was like one of my least favorite time periods I've had. This year I also ended up like fully ending like a chapter of my life that I had like basically like whenever I was like working at like one of my old jobs and all that. A lot of people that like used to work there in between like whenever I first started, and just even the people that like were working there like during 2021 2022 era, like I just feel like a lot of people were just really starting to leave this place like late last year and early in this year. And then basically I ended up leaving that place officially after the summer. I was actually like working there a little bit like whenever I was working at my warehouse job and all that, so but I wasn't working there as much like as I was like 2022 and before, like whenever I had the warehouse job. But basically ended up ending that chapter of my life, and I just feel like I lost a lot of people in my life after that ended up happening. So I kind of had to like move on to like another new chapter of my life and all that, and then it really was sad because like I had a lot of memories from like with the people there from like during that like 2020 2021 2022 era, and even like the last 2 years, but especially during those first 3 years. So I feel like a lot of things for me feel completely different than how they did during the beginning this year for me. So the trips I did this year were pretty amazing. I really enjoyed like that Smoky Mountains trip, and I also really enjoyed the East Coast trip. That was the best trip I ever went on in my life. And then Hot Springs in January, and I feel like this year definitely had good moments, but it definitely had bad moments too. Like I feel like a lot of the bad moments, most of the bad moments were like during the second half of the year, like after the East Coast trip and all that. So kind of an up and down year for me because the trips were really amazing, but I feel like outside of that, for the most part, it wasn't that great of a year for me other than like during the spring. So I feel like this is like a really hard year for me. Like whenever it came to like having the motivation to like get stuff done and wanting to do stuff and all that. So the last thing I'm probably gonna say about this year, like the last like major thing to say about 2025, like towards the end this year, I end up like having a lot of car problems like coming up like left and right and all that for like end of November, early December. So that was just really frustrating to deal with this year, and I feel like that just made my motivation even lower than it already was having that all that happen. Now I'm gonna be moving on to like how I felt about like each month that happened this year. So basically how I felt about like January this year, I think it was a pretty okay month. I ended up like having like a pretty good birthday celebration this year where I like went to Hot Springs like during my actual birthday and like the rest of that weekend too, because my birthday ended up falling on a Saturday this year. So I was able to like go out there on my birthday weekend and my actual birthday. So that ended up like being a pretty cool experience. And right before like my birthday weekend, I had like a pretty good like week of like being able to sled. There ended up like being a snowstorm like the weekend before my birthday, and that following week I was able to do like a lot of sledding and had a lot of fun with that. So but basically like once all that was kind of over and during like the second half of January, it was a pretty boring like part of the month, and it just felt like a filler time period where not a lot really happened, like nothing significant really happened during that time period. I honestly did like this January a lot more than the last two Januaries I had. I mean, it still wasn't like the most amazing month I had because I feel like most of it was like just like a really boring and just a lot of stuff didn't really happen. But I did have like a really good week, like during like my birthday week and all that, kind of similar to like what happened in January 2023. So basically, how I felt about like February, it kind of felt like the same for me as like the second half of January did, except pretty much almost nothing happened that entire month. So I think it was even more boring than like the second half of January was even. This year I didn't do quite as much stuff as I did last February because we didn't have as much warmer weather days other than like during the last week of the month. So in some ways it kind of did feel like February 2022 again, because like there was like a period of the month where we were having like frequent snowstorms, kind of like what happened in February 2022. So it wasn't as bad as it was during February 2022, but it still was kind of frustrating to deal with during that part of the month when we were having like frequent snowstorms. So definitely more boring than January was, and almost nothing happened for me that month. So basically how I felt about like March this year, it was definitely an improvement from like how February felt, and ended up like doing more stuff that I did throughout February. But even then, like it still wasn't too crazy of a month for me though. Spring break this year went back to like feeling like it has for me during the past, being a pretty boring break and not doing a whole lot during that time period. But I was able to spend a lot more time outside than I was during February and do some more stuff than that month. But even then, I still didn't do a whole lot that month. It definitely wasn't as good as like March of last year was, or like March of 2021 either, but it definitely was better than like some other Marches I've had during the past at least. So basically how I felt about like April this year is ended up like being a lot more exciting of a month than like February and March were. I ended up like doing like a couple of like spring day trips during that month, and I got to do a day trip out to like the Bennett Spring area again and did a hiking trail and saw like a natural tunnel there for the first time. And then I also did go to Cache River like towards the end of the month. So definitely like out of the first 4 months, it was the most fun month of this year. So May was honestly one of the worst months I had this year, like even worse than February was. And I did get to do like a couple of like really nice day trips during that month, like the best one being the Star Rock trip, but I also did check out some cool places later in the month. But I mean, other than that, like those like two like day trips, I feel like a lot of this month was just like a really hard month to get through. And it was also like the worst like Mother's Day I had because of like how work was that day and just how chaotic it was like on Mother's Day. So I didn't really get to like celebrate Mother's Day like I've done in the past, like during this decade, because of that. And it was just overall really chaotic. And Memorial Day was really boring this year. The weather was not that good at all, and it was like one of the first Memorial Days in a while that I didn't do Kinkaid Lake like I've done like the past 4 years. So May was not the best month this year, but June was definitely an improvement for May though. It was also when I like was starting to finally like do some summer day trips, and like
some of the summer weather was finally starting to set in, because I feel like this year was kind of a late start for summer. But June was like the month whenever I was finally starting to get to do some of that. It also was the best of like the first half of 2025 when it came to day trips. Like definitely the best month for day trips. I actually ended up like doing quite a bit of stuff throughout the month of June. Like I ended up going back to Bellsmith at the very beginning of the month, and it was my first time cliff jumping since my ankle injury too. So that was definitely an accomplishment in June. That was something I really liked about June this year. It was like my first month doing like Bellsmith, Castle River, and Kinkaid cliff jumping since my injury. So it definitely felt like a step forward and a step to getting back to like where I was before the injury happened. So like one of my biggest months of improvement, getting myself to be able to do stuff like that again. And I also did get to do a lot of swimming throughout the month after like not doing swimming since like August of last year. So it was like the month where I got to do like the most amount of swimming since then. So, and I also feel like this June was a lot better day trip experience for me than last year's June was, because just a lot of bad stuff happened on a lot of day trips last June, but didn't really have like that bad traffic this year compared to last year, and didn't get pulled over. Overall, I feel like out of the first like 6 months I had of 2025, like the first half of this year, June was definitely the best month I had so far for 2025. So basically how I felt about like July this year, it was easily the best month I had of this year, and definitely one of the top 5 best months of my life. I would even say it was in the top 3 best months.
I really did enjoy like every day that I was on this road trip this year, even like the days like that weren't quite as good as some of the other days. If you guys want to see more details about the road trip video, feel free to check out the review video. But July was overall a really amazing month. 4th of July was really amazing this year, the best 4th of July I ever had. Also, the road trip was probably the best road trip I've ever been on. So I was pretty much on the road trip for over half the month. So definitely the best month of the year in my opinion, and overall a really great month. I would even say it was better than August of 2022, which was like the previous month that like was the best month of my life. I would even say it's slightly better than that, but that was a really great month too. So basically how I felt about like August this year, it was easily like my least favorite month of this summer, especially like the first half of the month. I did have like some good memories like at the end of August, like with that one Kinkaid Lake trip and all that, but I mean, other than that, August was a really boring month. Like I was like the least amount of like summer stuff that I done like out of any summer month that I had this decade. And honestly, I mean, June 2021 was a really terrible month because of a lot of stuff I was going through that month. But I would say at least August 2025 was more boring than that month was even. But I mean, when it comes to like the stuff that I was going through, I mean, I wasn't going through quite as much throughout August 2025 as it was then. So it's really debatable if this was like the worst summer month that I had this decade, but I would say it's at least up there with June 2021 as being one of my least favorite summer months of the decade. So I just feel like the month like went by really, really slow, especially since I had just got back from the vacation not that long ago. It did kind of suck that I didn't really do that much because I was busy editing, but it was kind of enjoyable getting to edit some of those vacation videos and having it kind of feel like I was back on a vacation again, but it still wasn't the same as like actually getting the experience in person and living it. So like I was in July, so that was like one thing that was kind of enjoyable, but it did suck that I didn't really get to do that much that month. This is the worst August I had since I was like last in high school too, and the worst one that I had this decade. So basically how I felt about September this year, it was another month that really sucked this year for me, especially like during the first week of the month. I would even say that was a worse month than August was, in my opinion, and it was even more of a boring month for me than August was, because at least in August, like I did get to do that like one Kinkaid Lake trip at the very end of the month, but I pretty much did almost nothing throughout September, like nothing fun throughout that month. This year's September was still a lot better than last year's September though, because at least I wasn't going for like an ankle injury and all that. I ended up having to go through that throughout last September, so at least I wasn't having to go through that like at any point this year or throughout this September, so it was better than last year's September, but even more of a boring month than August was. So I felt like the first half of October was still pretty boring, and it felt like it kind of an extension of September. Even then though, I feel like the first half of October was still a lot more enjoyable than like August and September were though. I feel like the second half of this month was better though, especially like late October, like the last week of October, because fall was finally starting up, and I got to like do this like free day like Smoky Mountains getaway at the very end of the month too. So kind of similar to like what I did in October 2021 and 2023, except I did do it a little bit later in the month this year. But and I got to like spend like the actual Halloween day at the Smoky Mountains too. So that was a pretty nice experience and was nice actually like being away from home on Halloween, especially since it would have been on a Friday this year and would have been a lot better to be out of town on Halloween actually doing something than having to be stuck at home alone while everyone else is doing stuff. So really great timing for the trip, and this was definitely also one of the best Halloweens I had in my life too, because of like how enjoyable the Smoky Mountains was, like getting to be there on Halloween. So I definitely feel like the second half of this month was more enjoyable than the first half, and especially the last week in the month. But other than that, though, I feel like a lot of this month was pretty boring, though, except for like the very end of the month. So definitely improvement from August, September. So basically, how I felt about like November this year, that month was not my favorite month. This is probably my least favorite month of the year, but the very first day of the month was really good. It was like the last day of the Smoky Mountains and all that, but every day that I had like in between like the day that I got home from the Smoky Mountains and like Giant City was complete shit and all that. And then most of this month was pretty depressing for me though, especially during like the middle of the month. And I also did have like a lot of car problems happen this month too, so that was really stressful towards the end of the month. And yeah, November was definitely my least favorite month this year. I was not a fan this month other than like the very first day of the month and the day that I went to Giant City, but just an overall really crappy month. So, and lastly, how I felt about December this year, more on like the bad side, but there were some good moments I had this month though, like getting to see a couple of like Christmas lights, better than November at least. But honestly, I feel like this year's Christmas season was not quite as good as like the last two Christmas seasons I had. It was at least better than the 2022 Christmas season I had, but this was definitely not as good as the last two Christmas seasons. I feel like that's basically how I felt about like each month that I had this year. Honestly, this year probably had a lot more like bad months than other years, but I mean they weren't like quite as severe as some of the other years like bad months, but I feel like there was like just more bad months this year than other years. So basically the month that I feel like was the worst overall this year, I would have to say either September or November, but I think November was maybe slightly worse than September was even. So I feel like I had a pretty good Giant City trip and like also that first day at the Smoky Mountains, but I feel like that month was really crappy because of like all the car problems that were happening towards the end of the month, and it was really crappy time period like whenever I got back home from the Smoky Mountains too, and middle of November was pretty bad too. So I think November was slightly worse, but September was also a pretty crappy month this year too. So those were definitely my two worst months this year. And then basically the month that I liked the most this year, pretty obvious, July, because that was like when I was on the road trip for over half of the month and ended up like being the best trip I've ever done. So July was definitely better than any other month I had this year. Like it doesn't even come close. Like there's not another month that I had this year that came close like being as good as July this year. But I mean, some other months I did like this year though. I think April was pretty good too, and June. But even then, like they weren't like anywhere near as good as July was. So July was definitely my favorite month this year. So basically how I felt about like this year as a whole, I would say that 2025 was a very up and down year for me, and it was a difficult year like whenever it came to like my mental health and like adjusting to like my new home life and my job life being completely different than how it used to be in the past and all that. Like even more of like a dramatic change and like whenever I was like working the one warehouse job in 2023. This was a pretty difficult year when it came to adjusting to like a new home life and all that. Like I feel like this year was a lot more like monotonous than like any other year that I had this decade so far, including like whenever I was like working at the warehouse shop, and even compared to like last year even. I still did have some amazing moments throughout this year though, like during the trips I got to do, especially during like this year's summer road trip, and even during some of the day trips I did, even though they weren't like quite as good as some of the past day trip experiences. I mean, I still did have some good moments whenever I did some of the day trips this year. So I feel like if I didn't do the vacations this year, I feel like I would have been having way less uploads this year because I didn't really have like a lot of motivation to like want to do a whole lot of day trips this year compared to like in the past and all that. So I feel like the vacations really helped me to stay consistent because I feel like this would have been a very inconsistent year for me with uploads if I hadn't done the trip, especially like during the second half of the year. I feel like between April and June, I feel like things would still been decently consistent, like throughout this year, even without me doing the trips. But I feel like other than that, I feel like this would have been a really inconsistent year throughout most of the year. And I'm almost kind of glad that like the East Coast trip that I was originally supposed to do in 2023 ended up like getting pushed back to this year, because I feel like I wouldn't had it in me to like do all the day trips I did in 2023 this year if this ended up like happening this year and I did the East Coast trip in 2023 instead. So not just that, but I feel like 2023 had a lot of extra Kinkaid like visits as part of that as well, and I feel like I would have definitely not had that in me this year to like do all the extra Kinkaid like business I was able to that year. 2023 actually ended up like being a pretty good year for me at Kinkaid Lakes, much better than this year. So, and also not just that, but I didn't have a passport in 2023 as well, so I would have had to skip the whole Canada portion as well. So I'm definitely glad I did the East Coast trip this year and not in 2023. So basically, in conclusion, I would say that this was a year that was low-key only good like during the vacation parts of the year, or than maybe like during spring and the early half of summer, because I did have some pretty decent day trips throughout that time period. But I feel like this was definitely the worst year I experienced during my like regular day-to-day life since like my junior year of high school. But honestly, like even then, I feel like this was still a lot better of a year than during that era, because that was just a really terrible time period during my junior year of high school. I feel like this year was still not anywhere near as bad as like late 2018 was, especially November 2018. So I'm at least grateful for that, as well as like the times I was able to like be out of town this year. So that's basically kind of how I felt about 2025. I feel like this was like a really up and down year, where most of the good moments I had this year was like whenever I was out of town, but I did have a couple of good moments like whenever I did some of the day trips. But I feel like outside of that, this was a pretty crappy year, and I'm probably not going to miss this year a whole lot, or than the East Coast trip and like some of the other vacations I did. So that's basically how I felt about like 2025. So I really do hope you enjoyed today's video, and I really do hope you guys had a good year yourself. And if this wasn't a good year for any of you guys, I hope that next year is a lot better of a year than this year was. So stay tuned for the best moments videos coming out. Those are going to be my next two uploads. And then basically after that, I'm going to be starting up with some uploads from 2026. So I don't know like exactly when that's going to happen. It depends on like what I do throughout January and February. So stay tuned for 2026 uploads coming out after the best moments. And without further ado, I'll see you guys next year.